My 7-year-old grandson called desperate at night, "Grandpa, I'm so hungry." He locked me in. Mom won't wake up. I raced to their house, nobody opened the door. So I broke their window to get in, and what I found inside. Absolute nightmare. The wrench slipped in Norman Breer's calloused hand, and he caught it before it hit the concrete. 63 years of working with his hands had taught him to never let a tool fall. He wiped the grease from his fingers onto the rag hanging from his back pocket and studied the carburetor he'd been rebuilding. The overhead light in his garage cast harsh shadows across the workbench. And outside, darkness had already swallowed the lake. Cedar Ridge went quiet after sunset. That was one of the reasons Norman had stayed after his wife passed. The small lakeside town in northern Wisconsin didn't rush or crowd or ask too many questions. People kept to themselves. They waved when you drove past. They helped when you needed it, and they left you alone when you didn't. The phone rang. Norman glanced at the clock on the wall. 9:43. Late for a call, he set the carburetor down and walked to where his cell phone sat on the metal shelf next to a row of organized screwdrivers. The screen showed no caller ID. He answered, "Hello." Static crackled. Then a small voice barely above a whisper. "Grandpa." Norman's chest tightened. "Rowan." "Grandpa. I'm hungry." The boy's voice shook. Norman pressed the phone harder against his ear and stepped toward the garage door as if getting closer to the night might help him hear better. "Where are you? Are you home?" "He locked me in." Rowan's words broke into sobs. "Mom will wake up." "Grandpa, please." The wrench hit the floor this time. Norman didn't catch it. "Rowan, listen to me. Where's your mom?" "What room are you in?" "My room. The door has the lock on the outside." "I can't." The boy's voice dissolved into crying. "Where's Colton?" "I don't know. He left. Mom's on the floor and she won't talk to me." Norman was already moving. He grabbed his truck keys from the hook by the door and killed the garage light. His boots hit the gravel driveway and the cold October air bit at his face. The phone stayed pressed his ear. "Rowan, I'm coming right now. Stay on the phone with me. Can you do that?" "Okay." The boy sniffled. "Hurry, Grandpa. I'm scared." "I know. I'm getting in a truck now." Norman yanked, opened the driver's door, and climbed in. The engine roared to life, and he backed out fast, gravel spraying. His hands gripped the wheel so hard his knuckles went white. On the phone, he could hear Rowan crying softly, trying to be brave. "How long has your mom been on the floor?" "I don't know. Since before dinner. I called for her, but she didn't answer." Norman's jaw clenched. He pushed the gas pedal down and watched the speedometer climb. The road out his driveway curved through pine trees and his headlights cut through the darkness like knives. Did Colton hurt her? Silence. Then quietly I heard them yelling, then a big bang. Then nothing. Norman's vision blurred for a second. Not from tears. From rage so white-hot it made everything else fade. He blinked it away and focused on the road. "I'm 5 minutes away, buddy. Hang on." The drive to Ruby's house usually took 15 minutes. Norman made it in 8. He blew through 2 stop signs and didn't care. The houses along the lake road were dark and sleeping. No one saw him fly past. No one would have stopped him if they had. Ruby's house sat at the end of a gravel drive, surrounded by pine trees that blocked most of the view from the road. Norman pulled up and killed the engine. The house was completely dark, not even the porch light. He jumped out of the truck and ran to the front door, his fist hammered against the wood. "Ruby, open the door." Nothing. He tried the handle. Locked. Norman ran around to the side of the house, his breath coming fast, boots crunching on dry leaves. He kept his hands around his eyes and peered through a window. Too dark to see anything. "Grandpa." Rowan's voice came through the phone, still in his hand. "Are you here?" "I'm here. I'm coming in." Norman circled to the back. The kitchen door was locked, too. He stood there for half a second, weighing his options. Then he spotted the plastic lawn chair on the patio. He grabbed it, lifted it over his head, and smashed it through the kitchen window. Glass exploded inward. The sound echoed across the empty yard. Norman didn't care about noise. Didn't care about broken glass or alarms or neighbors calling the police. He knocked the remaining shards out of the frame with a chair leg and climbed through. The smell hit him first. Stale beer, rotting food, something metallic and sharp that made his stomach turn. Norman dropped into the kitchen and pulled out his phone's flashlight. The beam swept across the counter. Beer can stacked next to dirty plates. An overflowing trash bag leaning against the wall. The fridge door hung slightly open, and when Norman looked inside, it was nearly empty. A half-gallon of milk, some wilted lettuce, nothing else. Rowan, I'm inside. Where's your room? Down the hall. The last door. Norman moved fast. His boots crunched on broken glass as he crossed through the kitchen and into the living room. The TV was on, casting a flickering blue light across the room. Some late-night infomercial selling kitchen knives. The volume was turned down low, but it hummed in the background like a ghost. Beer cans covered the coffee table. The couch cushions were crooked and on the floor next to the couch. Ruby Norman's breath stopped. She lay on her side, one arm bent awkwardly beneath her. Her hair covered most of her face, but he could see the bruises. Dark purple spreading across her cheekbone, yellow-green along her jaw. Her chest rose and fell shallow but steady. Ruby. Norman dropped to his knees beside her. He touched her shoulder gently. Ruby, wake up. She didn't respond. Her eyelids fluttered but didn't open. Norman's hand shook as he pulled his phone out and dialed 911. But before he hit the call button, he remembered Rowan. The boy was still locked in his room. Norman stood and ran down the hallway. 3 doors. The first was a bathroom. The second was the master bedroom. The third had a steel padlock hanging from the outside. His stomach twisted a padlock on a child's bedroom door. On the outside, Norman grabbed the lock and yanked. It held. He backed up and kicked the door just below the handle. The wood cracked but didn't break. He kicked again harder. The frame splintered and the screws holding the latch tore free. The door swung open. Rowan sat on the floor in the corner, his knees pulled to his chest. He looked up when a light from the hallway spilled in. His face was pale, too pale. His eyes were red from crying. Grandpa. Norman crossed the room in 2 steps and scooped the boy into his arms. Rowan wrapped his thin arms around Norman's neck and buried his face in his grandfather's shoulder. You're okay now, Norman said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. I've got you. Rowan didn't say anything. He just held on. Norman carried him out of the room and back into the living room. He set the boy down on the couch away from where Ruby lay on the floor and pulled out his phone again. This time he called 911. The dispatcher answered on the second ring. 911. What's your emergency? I need an ambulance. My daughter's unconscious. She's been assaulted. What's your location? Norman gave the address. The dispatcher asked more questions. Is she breathing? Is the attacker still there? Are you injured? And Norman answered them all in short, clipped sentences. He kept his eyes on Ruby the whole time. She still hadn't moved. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later. Red and blue lights flooded the house. Paramedics rushed in with equipment and questions. Norman stood back and let them work. He answered what they asked. He gave them Colton's name. He told them what Rowan had said on the phone, and he watched as they loaded Ruby onto a stretcher and carried her out into the night. Rowan stood next to Norman, holding his grandfather's hand so tight it hurt. The boy didn't cry anymore. He just stared at his mother as they lifted her into the ambulance. Is she going to die? Rowan whispered. Norman looked down at him. No, she's tough like you. The boy nodded, but his grip didn't loosen. One of the paramedics walked over, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense expression. We're taking her to Cedar Ridge Memorial. You can follow us. I will. And him. She nodded toward Rowan. He's coming with me. Okay. The police are going to want to talk to both of you. Norman nodded. He'd expected that. The ambulance pulled away, siren wailing. Norman led Rowan to his truck and helped him into the passenger seat. The boy sat small and still, staring at his hands. Norman climbed into the driver's side and started the engine. Neither of them spoke as they followed the ambulance through the dark streets of Cedar Ridge. At the hospital, Norman and Rowan sat in the waiting room while doctors worked on Ruby. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The chairs were hard plastic, and the air smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee. Rowan leaned against Norman's side, eyes half closed but not sleeping. A detective arrived an hour later. He introduced himself as Detective Bill Harrison, Cedar Ridge PD. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt under a jacket and his badge hung from his belt. He looked tired. Mr. Breer, Norman stood. That's me. I need to ask you some questions about what happened tonight. Fine. They moved to a quieter corner of the waiting room. Rowan stayed in the chair watching them. Harrison pulled out a small notebook and a pen. Can you walk me through what happened? Norman did. He told him about the phone call, the locked door, the padlock on Rowan's room, finding Ruby on the floor. He kept his voice level and his answers direct. Harrison wrote everything down. And where's Colton Ward now? I don't know. He wasn't the house when I got there. Do you know where he might have gone? No. Harrison glanced toward Rowan as the boy said anything about what happened. He said he heard them fighting, then a loud noise, then nothing. Did he see Colton hit her? I didn't ask him that. Harrison nodded. He wrote something else in his notebook, then looked up. We'll need to talk to your daughter once she's awake. She's barely conscious. I understand, but we need her statement to move forward. Norman's jaw tightened. What about Colton? Are you going to arrest him? We need to locate him first. And we need evidence. The house is evidence. The padlock on a 6-year-old's door is evidence. My daughter's face is evidence. I hear you, Mr. Breer, but we have to follow procedure. We'll find him and bring him in for questioning. Norman stared at the detective. Questioning? That's right. Not arresting. Questioning? We need her statement first. Norman didn't respond. He just looked at Harrison until the detective shifted his weight and cleared his throat. I'll be in touch, Harrison said. He handed Norman a business card. Call me if you think of anything else. Norman took the card without looking at it. Harrison left. Norman walked back to where Rowan sat and lowered himself into the chair beside the boy. Rowan looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. Are they going to get him? Rowan asked quietly. Norman didn't answer right away. He watched the detective disappear through the automatic doors into the parking lot. Then he looked down at his grandson. We'll see, he said. But inside, something cold and hard settled into place. Because Norman had seen this before, not with his own family, but with others. He'd watched the system move slow while bad men moved fast. He'd seen promises made and broken. He'd seen people fall through cracks that should never have existed. And he'd be damned if he let that happen to Ruby and Rowan. A nurse appeared from the double doors leading to the emergency room. She looked around then spotted Norman. Mr. Breer? He stood. Yes, your daughter's awake. She's asking for you. Norman took Rowan's hand and they followed the nurse through the doors. The emergency room was a maze of curtained-off beds and rolling equipment. The nurse led them to a bed in the corner. Ruby lay propped up on pillows and 4 in her arm, monitors beeping softly beside her. Her face was worse under the bright lights. The bruises were darker, more defined. Her left eye was swollen, nearly shut, and a cut above her eyebrow had been stitched closed. She looked fragile in a way Norman had never seen before. When she saw them, tears spilled down her cheeks. Rowan, the boy, ran to her side. Ruby reached for him with her free hand and he pressed himself against the bed rail, trying to get as close as possible without climbing in. She ran her fingers through his hair, whispering things Norman couldn't hear. Norman stayed back, giving him space, but his eyes never left his daughter's face. After a moment, Ruby looked up at him. Dad, I'm sorry. Don't, Norman said. His voice was quiet, but firm. Don't apologize. I should have. You don't owe me an explanation. Ruby's face crumpled. I tried to leave. I did, but he said he'd take Rowan. He said I'd never see him again. He said, stop. Norman moved closer. He rested his hand on the bed rail. I know what he said and I know what he did and it's over now. Ruby shook her head. It's not over. He'll come back. He always comes back. And when he does, he's not touching you again. The certainty in Norman's voice made Ruby stop. She looked at him, searching his face for something. Maybe doubt, maybe hesitation. She didn't find any. Dad. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Please don't make him angry. Please. You don't know what he's like when he's angry. Norman leaned closer. I don't care what he's like. Ruby closed her eyes. A tear slid down her bruised cheek. Rowan reached up and wiped it away with his small hand. They stayed like that for a while. Ruby holding Rowan. Norman standing guard. The monitors beeped. The fluorescent lights hummed. And somewhere in the distance, an ambulance siren wailed as it brought someone else's emergency through the hospital doors. Eventually, a doctor came by to check on Ruby. He confirmed she had a concussion, 3 bruised ribs, and significant soft tissue damage. They wanted to keep her overnight for observation. Ruby agreed without argument. She was too tired to fight. Norman told her he'd take Rowan home with him. She nodded. Thank you, she whispered. Norman didn't respond. He just squeezed her hand once, then led Rowan back out to the truck. The drive back through his house was quiet. Rowan stared out the window at the dark lake passing by. Norman kept both hands on the wheel and his thoughts to himself. When they pulled into the driveway, Rowan finally spoke. Grandpa, yeah. Are you mad at me? Norman parked and turned off the engine. He looked at the boy. Why would I be mad at you? Because I called you. Because I made you break the window, Rowan. Norman turned in his seat to face him fully. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. You called for help. That's not something to be sorry about. That's something to be proud of. Rowan's lower lip trembled. But what if Colton comes back? What if he's mad? If he comes back, he'll have to go through me first. The boy nodded slowly. Okay. They went inside. Norman made Rowan a peanut butter sandwich and a glass of milk. The boy ate slowly like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to finish it. Norman sat across from him at the kitchen table and watched. When Rowan was done, Norman showed him to the guest bedroom. It was small and plain, but the bed was soft and the window looked out over the lake. You can sleep here tonight, Norman said. And tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next. Can I call Mom in the morning? She needs to rest tonight. Rowan climbed in a bed, still wearing his clothes from earlier. Norman found an extra blanket in the closet and spread it over him. The boy looked so small under all that fabric. Good night, Grandpa. Good night, buddy. Norman turned off the light and closed the door most of the way, leaving it open just a crack. Then he walked back to the kitchen and sat down at the table. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the lake lapping against the shore. Norman pulled out his phone and looked at the time. 2:17 in the morning. He should be exhausted, but he wasn't. His mind was sharp, clear, focused. He opened a drawer in the kitchen and pulled out a spiral notebook. It was one he used for keeping track of repair jobs, but the last 20 pages were blank. He flipped to the first empty page and wrote today's date. 8 at the top. Then he started writing everything he could remember. The phone call, the locked bedroom, the padlock, the smell of the house, the beer cans, the empty fridge, Ruby's bruises, what Rowan had said, what the paramedics had said, what the detective had said. He wrote for an hour. When he was finished, he closed a notebook and set it on the table. Then he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. Norman Breer had spent his whole life fixing things. Engines, tools, plumbing. Anything that broke, he could put back together. But some things couldn't be fixed. Some things could only be stopped. And Colton Ward was one of them. Act in 1. The next morning, Norman woke before sunrise. He hadn't slept much, maybe 2 hours total, but his body didn't feel tired. It felt coiled. Ready, he made coffee and eggs. Rowan wandered into the kitchen around 7, rubbing his eyes. Norman fed him breakfast and called the hospital. Ruby was stable, resting, no change. The nurse said they'd probably release her by afternoon. Norman told Rowan they'd visit after lunch. The boy nodded and went to sit on the couch staring at the TV without turning it on. Norman spent the morning making phone calls. He contacted a lawyer he knew in town, a woman named Patricia Vo, who specialized in family law. He told her the basics. She listened without interrupting, then said she'd look into filing for emergency custody. Norman thanked her and hung up. Then he called the hospital again. This time he asked if Colton Ward had tried to visit Ruby. The nurse checked the log. No visitors besides Norman and Rowan. Norman thanked her and hung up. He paced the kitchen. His boots clicked against the linoleum. He poured more coffee, drank it black. Pour more. His mind turned over possibilities. Where would Colton go? What would he do? Would he run? Or would he come back? Norman knew men like Colton. He'd met them before on job sites, in bars, at the hardware store. They talked smooth, smiled easy, but underneath they were hollow, and hollow men didn't run. They doubled down. They blamed everyone else. They convinced themselves they were the victims. Colton would come back. Norman was sure of it. The question was when. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Norman and Rowan drove back to the hospital. Ruby was sitting up in bed, looking better than she had the night before. The swelling around her eye had gone down slightly, though the bruises were even darker now. She hugged Rowan tight and asked him how he slept. Good, Rowan lied. Ruby smiled at him. Then she looked at Norman. The doctor says I can go home today. You're not going home, Norman said. You're coming to my place. Ruby started to protest. Dad, I can't just you can and you will, but my house is a crime scene. The police still need to process it. That part was true. Harrison had called earlier to say they'd be sending a forensic team to collect evidence. Norman hadn't mentioned that to Ruby yet. Now seemed like a good time. Ruby's face fell. Right. Of course, you need somewhere safe. My place is safe. She didn't argue. Maybe she was too tired. Or maybe she knew he was right. Either way, she nodded. They waited while the doctors signed the discharge papers and a nurse brought Ruby a wheelchair. Hospital policy. Ruby didn't fight it. She just sat down and let them wheel her out to Norman's truck. The drive back to his house was quiet. Rowan sat between them, holding his mother's hand. Ruby stared out the window. Norman drove. When they pulled into the driveway, Ruby finally spoke. "Thank you, Dad." Norman didn't respond. He just parked and helped her out of the truck. Inside, he showed her to the guest bedroom. Rowan had slept there the night before, but Norman had already changed the sheets and cleaned up. Ruby lowered herself onto the bed and winced. "Do you need anything?" Norman asked. "No, I'm okay." She wasn't, but Norman didn't push. He closed the door and let her rest. Rowan stayed in the living room, playing quietly with a deck of cards Norman had given him. Norman returned to the kitchen and opened his notebook. He read over what he'd written the night before, then added a new entry. October 17th, Ruby discharged from hospital. Bruises, left eye, cheekbone, jaw, right shoulder, ribs bruised, concussion. Doctor mentioned consistent with blunt force trauma. Ruby confirmed Colton responsible. Still no sign of him. Norman set the pen down and stared at the words. Blunt force trauma. That was the clinical way of saying someone had beaten his daughter nearly unconscious. His jaw clenched. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Norman stood and walked to the front of the house. Through the window, he could see a police cruiser parked in the driveway. He opened the door. Detective Harrison stood on the porch looking just as tired as he had the night before. "Mr. Branner, got a minute?" "Sure." Norman stepped outside and closed the door behind him. He didn't want Rowan hearing this conversation. Harrison leaned against the porch railing. "We processed the house this morning. Found some things like what? Empty liquor bottles, signs of a struggle in the living room, the padlock you mentioned, and we took photos of your daughter's injuries." "Good. So, when are you arresting him?" Harrison sighed. "It's not that simple." "It sounds pretty simple. We still need to locate him and we need your daughter's formal statement. She already told you what happened. We need on record official Norman crosses arms when today if possible. I can come back later or she can come down to the station. She's not going anywhere. You can talk to her here." "That works." Harrison paused. You seem to be choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Breer, I want you to know we're taking this seriously, but these cases, they take time. We have to build a case that'll hold up in court. I don't care about court. I care about keeping him away from my family. I understand and we'll do everything we can, but you need to stay patient. Let us handle this." Norman stared at him. "And if he shows up before you handle this, call us immediately. Don't engage with him. He already threatened my daughter and locked my grandson in a room. What do you think he'll do if he comes back? That's why we need to find him first." Norman didn't respond. He just looked at Harrison until the detective shifted his weight and checked his watch. "I'll come back in a couple hours to take her statement." Harrison said, "In the meantime, keep your doors locked." "I always do." Harrison walked back to his cruiser and drove away. Norman stood on the porch for a long time after he left, staring at the trees lining the driveway. Keep your doors locked as if a lock would stop a man like Colton. Norman went back inside. He checked on Ruby, still resting. He checked on Rowan, still playing cards. Then he went to his bedroom and opened the closet. On the top shelf, behind a stack of old blankets, he found what he was looking for, a lock box. Inside was a revolver, a Smith & Wesson .38 Special. He bought it years ago back when he and his wife had first moved to Cedar Ridge for protection. She'd said just in case. They never needed it. But Norman had kept it clean and loaded just in case. Now felt like the right time for just in case. He checked the cylinder. 6 rounds. He closed the box and slid it back onto the shelf. Then he closed the closet door and returned to the kitchen. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Harrison came back. Norman let him in and led him to the guest bedroom. Ruby was awake, sitting up in bed with a cup of tea Norman had brought her earlier. She looked nervous when she saw the detective. "Mrs. Ward," Harrison said gently, "I need to ask you some questions about what happened. Is that okay?" Ruby nodded. Harrison pulled out his notebook and sat in the chair by the window. Norman leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Harrison glanced at him, but didn't ask him to leave. "Can you walk me through what happened the night of October 16th? Ruby took a shaky breath. "Colton and we had a fight about money. He'd been drinking. He was angry because I'd asked him to help pay for groceries. He said I was ungrateful, that I didn't appreciate everything he did for us." "Did he hit you?" Ruby's hands tightened around the teacup. "Yes." "Where?" "My face. My ribs. He shoved me against the wall first, then he hit me. I don't know how many times. I tried to protect my head, but," her voice trailed off. Harrison wrote in his notebook. "And what about Rowan?" "He was in his room. I told Colton to leave him alone, but he locked the door. He said Rowan needed to learn discipline. That I was too soft on him. Did Colton leave after that? I think so. I don't remember. Everything went black after he hit me the last time. Harrison nodded. And how long has this been going on? Ruby didn't answer right away. She stared at the teacup. A long time, months, years, 2 years, maybe more. It started small, yelling, pushing. Then it got worse. Why didn't you report it? Ruby's voice dropped to a whisper. Because he said he'd take Rowan. He said I'd never see him again. He said no one would believe me. Harrison's expression softened. Mrs. Ward, I need you to understand something. You're not at fault here. What he did to you, that's assault. And what he did to your son, that's child endangerment. We're going to do everything we can to make sure he doesn't hurt you again. Ruby nodded, but she didn't look convinced. Harrison asked a few more questions about previous incidents, about witnesses, about where Colton might have gone, and Ruby answered as best she could. When he was finished, he stood and closed his notebook. Thank you, he said. I know that wasn't easy. Ruby didn't respond. Harrison left. Norman walked him to the door. We'll put out a warrant for his arrest. Harrison said, should have it by tomorrow. And if he shows up before then, call 911. Don't try to handle it yourself. Norman nodded. He didn't make any promises. After Harrison left, Norman went back to check on Ruby. She was crying quietly, her face buried in her hands. Norman sat on the edge of the bed and didn't say anything. Sometimes there was nothing to say. Sometimes you just had to sit there and let someone feel what they needed to feel. Eventually, Ruby wiped her eyes and looked at him. I'm sorry you have to deal with this. Stop apologizing. She took a shaky breath. I should have left sooner. I should have protected Rowan better. I should have. Ruby. Norman's voice was firm but not harsh. You did what you thought you had to do to keep your son safe. That's not weakness. That's survival. But I let him hurt me. I let him lock Rowan in that room. You didn't let him do anything. He made choices, bad ones. And now he's going to pay for them. Ruby searched his face. Dad, what are you going to do? Norman stood. I'm going to make sure he never touches you again. Please don't do anything that'll get you in trouble. Norman didn't respond. He just walked to the door and turned back to look at her. Get some rest. We'll figure this out. He closed the door and went back to the kitchen. The notebook sat on the table, open to the last entry. Norman picked up his pen and added more notes, times, dates, details from Ruby's statement, everything the detective had asked, everything Ruby had said. Then he added a new section at the bottom of the page. Next steps, contact Ruby's old co-workers. Find out more about Colton's past. Talk to anyone who might have information. Norman closed a notebook and set it aside. Then he pulled out his phone and started making a list of people to call. Ruby had worked at a small bakery in town before she married Colton. The owner's name was Helen. Norman had met her a few times. She'd seemed like a good woman, someone who paid attention. He'd start there. The next morning, Norman left Ruby and Rowan at the house and drove into town. Cedar Ridge's main street was quiet. A few shops, a diner, a hardware store, and at the end of the block, a small bakery with a hand-painted sign that read Helen's Kitchen. Norman parked and went inside. The smell of fresh bread hit him immediately. Warm, comforting, the kind of smell that made you forget about everything else for a second. Helen stood behind the counter, wiping down the glass display case. She looked up and the bell above the door chimed. Norman, long time, Helen. Norman nodded. Got a minute to talk. Her smile faded. Is this about Ruby? Yeah. Helen glanced at the empty shop, then gestured to a table in the corner. Sit. I'll grab us some coffee. They sat across from each other. Helen poured 2 cups from a carafe she kept behind the counter. Norman thanked her and took a sip. It was good coffee. Strong, not burnt. How is she? Helen asked. She's alive. Barely. Helen's face fell. I heard something happened. Word travels fast in a town like this. What did you hear? That she was in the hospital. That Colton hurt her. Helen set her cup down and leaned forward. I tried to warn her, you know. When she first started seeing him, something about him didn't sit right with me. What do you mean? He used to come into the bakery all the time. At first, I thought he was just being sweet, bringing her lunch, checking on her. But then I noticed he'd call her during her shift multiple times. He'd show up right when she was about to leave. He'd ask where she was going, who she was talking to. It felt controlling. Norman's jaw tightened. Did you say anything to her? I tried, but she said he was just protective, that he cared about her. I didn't push it. Maybe I should have. Did he ever hurt her? While she was working for you, Helen hesitated. I don't know. She started wearing long sleeves, even in the summer. And once I saw a bruise on her wrist, she said she'd bumped into a door. But Helen shook her head. I should have done more. You did what you could. Did I? Because she stopped working here 6 months after she married him. He said she didn't need to work anymore. That he'd take care of her. And I never saw her again. Not until I heard she was in the hospital. Norman leaned back in his chair. Do you know anything else about him? Where he worked? Who his friends were? He said he was in sales. Traveled a lot, but I don't know what company. Asked for friends. Helen frowned. I never saw him with anyone. He was always alone. Norman nodded. He pulled out his notebook and wrote down everything Helen had said. Then he looked up. If you think of anything else, call me. Helen reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Tell Ruby I'm thinking about her. I will. Norman left the bakery and drove to his next stop, the elementary school, Rowan's school. He wanted to talk to the counselor, find out if anyone there had noticed anything wrong. The receptionist at the front desk recognized him. She called the counselor, a young woman named Emily, who looked like she was fresh out of college. And Emily met him in a small office near the library. Mr. Breer, she said, shaking his hand. I heard about what happened. I'm so sorry. Thank you. Norman sat down. I wanted to ask you about Rowan. Has he ever mentioned anything about what was happening at home? Emily shifted in her seat. We're not supposed to discuss students without parental consent. I have consent. Ruby's my daughter. She's staying with me now. Emily hesitated. Then she sighed. Rowan, he's been struggling for months. He used to be outgoing, happy, but this year he's been withdrawn, quiet. He doesn't play with the other kids as much, and a few times I noticed bruises. Norman's chest tightened. What kind of bruises? On his arms, his wrists. I asked him about them and he said he fell, but they didn't look like fall bruises. They looked deliberate. Did you report it? I did. I called CPS. They sent someone to the house. But Ruby, she said everything was fine. That Rowan was just clumsy. She begged me not to pursue it. Said it would make things worse. Norman closed his eyes, so they dropped it. They said there wasn't enough evidence to warrant further investigation. Norman stood. His hands were shaking. Not from fear, from rage. Thank you for your time. Emily stood too. Mr. Breer, if there's anything I can do to help. There's not. He walked out before she could say anything else. The rest of the day blurred together. Norman made more calls. He talked to a neighbor who lived near Ruby's house. She said she'd heard shouting a few times, but she never called the police. I didn't want to get involved, she said. Norman thanked her and hung up. He talked to a man at the hardware store who'd sold Colton a deadbolt lock 6 months ago. He said it was for his garage, the man said. Norman didn't respond. He just added it to his notebook. By the time he got home, it was after 6. Ruby and Rowan were in the living room watching TV. Ruby looked better. The swelling had gone down more. Rowan looked tired. Norman made dinner. Spaghetti. Nothing fancy. They ate in silence. Afterward, Ruby put Rowan to bed and Norman returned to the kitchen. He opened his notebook and added everything he'd learned that day. By the time he finished, it was after midnight. His hand itched from writing, but the notebook was fuller now. Evidence, patterns, a clear picture of who Colton Ward was and what he'd done. Norman closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair. He stared at the ceiling. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of his own breathing. Tomorrow, he thought, tomorrow, I'll dig deeper. Because Norman knew something the police didn't. He knew that waiting for the system to work was the same as waiting for nothing at all. And he wasn't about to let Colton Ward slip through the cracks. Not this time. Not ever. The next afternoon, Norman got the call he'd been waiting for. Colton Ward had shown up at the hospital. Detective Harrison called to give him a heads up. He tried to see your daughter. We turned him away, but he's here in the parking lot. Thought you should know. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Norman grabbed his keys and drove fast. Ruby and Rowan stayed to the house. He didn't tell them where he was going. Didn't want them to worry. When he pulled into the hospital parking lot, he spotted Colton immediately. The man stood near the entrance talking on his phone. He wore a pressed shirt and clean jeans. His hair was combed. He looked calm, collected, like a man who hadn't beaten his wife nearly to death 2 days ago. Norman parked and got out of the truck. Colton saw him and ended his call. He smiled. Norman, he said, his voice smooth and friendly. I was hoping I'd run into you. Norman walked toward him. You're not seeing her. I just want to talk. Make sure she's okay. She's fine. No, thanks to you. Colton's smile didn't waver. I understand you're upset. But I think there's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding. You put her in the hospital. That's not true. She fell. She's clumsy when she gets tired. I told the police that Norman stopped a few feet away. He studied Colton. The man was good. He didn't flinch, didn't break eye contact. He stood there like he believed every word coming out of his mouth. You locked my grandson in his room, Norman said quietly. He needed discipline. Ruby's too soft on him. Someone has to teach him boundaries by locking him in a room with a padlock. It wasn't locked. He could have opened it if he tried. Norman took a step closer. I broke that door down. It was locked. From the outside, Colton's smile finally faded. His eyes hardened. You broke into my house. That's illegal. You should be careful, Norman. Actions have consequences. You threatening me? Just giving you advice. Monto man. Norman stared at him. And in that moment, he understood something important. Colton Ward wasn't afraid. He wasn't worried about the police. Wasn't worried about being arrested. He thought he was untouchable. He thought he could smile and talk his way out of anything. And maybe he could, but not forever. Stay away from my daughter, Norman said. Stay away from my grandson or we're going to have a problem. Colton's smile returned. Your daughter is my wife. My son is my son. You don't get to tell me what to do. I just did. And what are you going to do if I don't listen? Hurt me? Because that's assault, Norman. And I'd be happy to press charges. Norman didn't respond. He just turned and walked back to his truck. Behind him, Colton called out. Tell Ruby I love her. Tell her I'll be waiting. Norman climbed into the truck and started the engine. His hands gripped the wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He wanted to go back. Wanted to wipe that smirk off Colton's face. But he didn't because Colton was right about one thing. Actions had consequences. And Norman was going to make sure Colton faced every single one of them. When Norman got home, Ruby was in the kitchen. She looked pale. Dad, Detective Harrison called. He said, Colleton, try to see me at the hospital. He did. I sent him away. He's going to come here. I know he is. Then he'll have to deal with me. Ruby shook her head. You don't understand. He's not going to stop. He never stops. He'll find a way. He always does. Norman sat down at the table. Ruby, listen to me. He's not untouchable. He thinks he is, but he's not. He has money. He has lawyers. He has nothing that matters. Not anymore. Ruby stared at him. What are you planning? I'm planning to make sure he never hurts you again. Dad, please don't do anything that'll get you in trouble. I can't lose you, too. Norman reached across the table and took her hand. You're not going to lose me. I promise. Ruby didn't look convinced, but she nodded. That night, Norman couldn't sleep again. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through everything he'd learned over the past few days. Colton's arrogance, his confidence, his belief that he was smarter than everyone else. That was his weakness. And Norman was going to exploit it. Norman spent the next 2 days planning. He didn't tell Ruby what he was doing. Didn't tell anyone. He just worked quietly, methodically, like he was rebuilding an engine. One piece at a time. First, he called Patricia Voss, the family lawyer. She'd already started the paperwork for emergency custody of Rowan. Norman asked her to expedite it. She said she'd do her best. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Will Ruby need to be there? Patricia asked. Probably. And Colton, he'll be served notice. Whether he shows up is his choice. Norman thanked her and hung up. Next, he installed a security system, cameras, motion sensors, audio recording. He set them up around the perimeter of his house and at both entrances. He tested them twice to make sure they worked. Then, he linked them to his phone so he could monitor everything remotely. When Ruby asked what he was doing, he told her the truth. I want to know if anyone comes near this house. Ruby didn't argue. Rowan stayed quiet during those days. He spent most of his time drawing pictures or playing with the old toys Norman had saved from Ruby's childhood. Sometimes he asked when they could go home. Norman always said the same thing soon. But Norman wasn't planning on letting them go back to that house. Not ever. On the third day, Norman drove back into town. He needed one more piece of information. Colton's past. Helen had said he traveled for work, but she didn't know details. Norman wanted to know where he'd been, who he worked for, and most importantly, if there was anyone else he'd hurt. He started at the county clerk's office. Public records. It took an hour of searching through old files, but eventually he found something. Colton Ward had been arrested 5 years ago in a neighboring county. Domestic assault. The charges had been dropped when the victim refused to testify. Norman wrote down the victim's name. Then he went to the library and used one of the public computers to search for her online. Her name was Jennifer Hayes. She lived 2 towns over. Norman found a phone number and called. A woman answered on the 3rd ring. "Hello, Jennifer Hayes." "Yes, my name is Norman Breer. I'm calling about Colton Ward." There was a long pause, then quietly, "What about him?" "He hurt my daughter. I'm trying to gather information. Anything that might help keep him away from her?" Another pause. "I don't want to get involved." "Understand, but if there's anything you can tell me." "He's dangerous," Jennifer said suddenly. Her voice was tight. "Scared. He's good at making you think you're the problem. That you're the one who's broken, but he's the one who breaks you. He broke me. And when I tried to leave, he told me he'd kill me. He said he'd make it look like an accident. I believed him." Norman's grip tightened on the phone. "Why didn't you testify?" "Because he found where I was staying. He sent me flowers with a note that said, 'I know where you sleep.' So, I dropped the charges and I left town. I haven't seen him since." "Do you have anything in writing? Texts? Emails?" "I deleted everything. I was too scared to keep it." Norman exhaled slowly. "Thank you for telling me. Is your daughter safe?" "She will be good because if he gets away with it again," Jennifer's voice trailed off. "Just be careful. He's smarter than people think." Norman hung up and added her testimony to his notebook. Then he drove home. That evening, Norman sat at the kitchen table with his notebook open in front of him. He read through every entry, every detail, every piece of evidence he collected, and then he started planning his next move. Colton Ward thought he was untouchable. He thought he could talk his way out of anything. He thought Norman was just an old man who'd get tired and give up. He was wrong. Norman knew something Colton didn't. He knew that arrogant men made mistakes. They got sloppy. They overestimated themselves and underestimated everyone else. And when they did, they left openings. All Norman had to do was wait for the opening and then strike. The opening came 2 days later. It was late. After 10, Norman was in the garage organizing tools when his phone buzzed. A notification from the security system. Motion detected at the front door. Norman grabbed his phone and pulled up the camera feed. The screen showed a figure standing on his porch. A man tall wearing a jacket. "Colton." Norman set the phone down and walked into the house. Ruby and Rowan were asleep. Good. He didn't want them hearing this. He checked the revolver in the closet, still loaded. Then he went to the front door and opened it. Colton stood there, hands in his pockets, that same smooth smile on his face. "Norman," he said, "we need to talk." "No, we don't." "I think we do. See, I got a notice today. Says you're trying to take my son away from me. That true?" Norman didn't respond. Colton took a step closer. "You can't do that. He's my son. Ruby's my wife. This is my family, not yours. You lost the right to call them family when you put your hands on them." Colton's smile faded. His voice dropped. "You think you're some kind of hero? You think breaking into my house and filing legal paperwork makes you a good man? You're just a meddling old fool who can't mind his own business. Get off my property or what? You'll call the cops. Go ahead, because when they get here, I'll tell them how you've been harassing me. How you threatened me at the hospital. How you've been turning my wife against me." Norman stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind him. "You came here to threaten me? I came here to warn you. Stay out of my life or I'll make sure you regret it." Norman stared at him and then he smiled. Not a friendly smile. A cold one. "Say that again." Colton blinked. "What?" "Say it again about how you'll make me regret it. Say it louder. Make sure I hear you clearly." Colton's eyes narrowed. "What are you?" And then he saw it. The small camera mounted above the door. The red light blinking. Recording. Colton's face drained of color. Norman's smile widened. "You were saying?" Colton stepped back. His smooth confidence cracked. "You're recording this?" "Every word." "That's illegal." "No, it's not. This is my property. I have the right to record anyone who steps onto it. And you just threatened me on camera with audio." Colton's jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists. "You think you're smart? Smarter than you." Colton took another step back. His eyes darted between Norman and the camera. Then he turned and walked quickly down the driveway. His car was parked on the street. He climbed in and sped off, tires screeching. Norman stood on the porch and watched until the tail lights disappeared. Then he went back inside and pulled up the security footage on his phone. He replayed it twice. Then he saved it to 3 different places. His phone, his laptop, a USB drive. This was it. This was the opening. Colton had just handed him everything he needed. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Norman spent the weekend preparing. He printed copies of the security footage. He organized his notebook into a clean typed document. He contacted Jennifer Hayes again and asked if she'd be willing to provide a written statement. She hesitated, but eventually agreed. Norman drove 2 towns over to pick it up. On Monday, he met with Patricia Voss. She reviewed everything he gathered. The medical reports, the photos of Ruby's injuries, the testimony from Helen and the school counselor, the arrest record, Jennifer's statement, and the security footage of Colton threatening Norman. Patricia looked up at him when she finished. This is comprehensive. Will it be enough? It should be, but you need to prepare yourself. Colton will have a lawyer, and he'll fight this. Let him. Tuesday morning arrived cold and gray. Norman woke early, showered, and put on the only suit he owned. It was old but clean. Ruby came out of the guest bedroom wearing a dress Norman hadn't seen in years. She looked nervous. Are you ready? Norman asked. Ruby nodded, but her hands were shaking. He's going to be there, she said quietly. I know. What if, Ruby? Norman put his hand on her shoulder. It's going to be okay. Trust me, she nodded again. But the fear didn't leave her eyes. They left Rowan with a neighbor Norman trusted, an older woman named Beatrice, who'd known Ruby since she was a child. She promised to keep him safe. Norman thanked her and drove Ruby to the courthouse. The building was old and gray with tall columns and narrow windows. Inside, it smelled like old paper and floor polish. They met Patricia in the lobby. She went over the plan one more time. Then they headed to the courtroom. Colton was already there. He sat at the defendant's table with his lawyer, a sharp-looking man in an expensive suit. Colton wore a suit, too. He looked calm, confident. When Ruby walked in, he smiled at her. Ruby looked away. The judge entered. A woman in her 50s with gray hair and sharp eyes. Everyone stood, then she gestured for them to sit. This is a hearing for emergency temporary custody of Rowan Ward. The judge said, Mr. Breer, you're petitioning for custody. Norman stood. Yes, Your Honor. On what grounds? Patricia stood. Your Honor, we have evidence of domestic abuse, child endangerment, and ongoing threats against the family. Colton's lawyer stood. Your Honor, my client denies these allegations. This is a clear case of family interference. Mr. Breer has been harassing my client for weeks. The judge held up her hand. I'll hear the evidence. Ms. Voss, proceed. Patricia presented everything. The medical reports, the photos, the statements from Helen and Emily. Jennifer's written testimony, and finally, the security footage. The judge watched it without expression. When Colton's voice filled the courtroom, you can't do that. He's my son. Ruby's my wife. This is my family. Ruby flinched when he said, stay out of my life or I'll make sure you regret it. The judge's eyes narrowed. The footage ended. The courtroom was silent. Colton's lawyer stood. Your Honor, that recording was taken without my client's knowledge. It's inadmissible. Actually, Patricia said, it's entirely admissible. The recording was made on Mr. Breer's private property where he has every legal right to install security cameras. Your client was trespassing. He was attempting to have a civil conversation. He was making threats. The judge held up her hand again. Enough. Mr. Ward, do you have anything to say? Colton stood. He looked at the judge, then at Ruby. His voice was smooth. Calm, Your Honor. I love my wife. I love my son. I would never hurt them. This is all a misunderstanding. My father-in-law has been interfering in our marriage from the beginning. He's trying to turn Ruby against me. And the medical evidence? The judge asked. Ruby fell. She's clumsy. I've told her to be more careful, but she fell hard enough to crack 3 ribs and give herself a concussion. Colton hesitated. It was a bad fall. And the padlock on your son's door, that was for his safety. He wanders at night with a lock on the outside. Colton didn't answer. The judge leaned back in her chair. She looked at Colton for a long time. Then she looked at Norman, then at Ruby. Mrs. Ward, the judge said. Do you feel safe with your husband? Ruby stood slowly. Her voice was barely a whisper. No. Do you want your son to be with him? No. The judge nodded. She wrote something on the paper in front of her. Then she looked up. I'm granting emergency temporary custody to Norman Breer. Mr. Ward. You are prohibited from contacting Mrs. Ward or Rowan Ward until further notice. If you violate this order, You'll be arrested. Do you understand? Colton's face went red. Your Honor, this is do you understand? Colton's jaw clenched. Yes. Good. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Ward out of the courtroom. The bailiff stepped forward. Colton stood. For a moment, Norman thought he might do something stupid, something reckless, but Colton just glared at Norman, then at Ruby, and then walked out. The judge stood. This hearing is adjourned. Norman and Ruby walked out of the courtroom together. Ruby was crying. Not sad tears. Relief. She grabbed Norman's arm and held on tight. Thank you, she whispered. Norman didn't respond. He just put his arm around her and led her out of the building. Outside, Detective Harrison was waiting. He walked over when he saw them. Mr. Branner, Mrs. Ward, Detective Norman said, I heard about the hearing. Congratulations. Thanks. Harrison glanced back at the courthouse. We also have a warrant for Mr. Ward's arrest. Multiple charges, assault, child endangerment, witness intimidation. Once we find him, he's going away for a while. Good, Norman said. Harrison nodded. Stay safe and call if you need anything. He walked away. Norman and Ruby stood there for a moment watching the courthouse steps. Colton was gone. The lawyer was gone. It was just the two of them. Is it really over? Ruby asked. Norman looked at her. For now, what if he comes back? Then we'll deal with it. They drove home in silence. When they pulled into the driveway, Beatrice was waiting on the porch with Rowan. The boy ran to his mother and Ruby scooped him up, holding him tight. We're safe now, she whispered into his hair. We're safe. Rowan nodded against her shoulder. Norman watched them and for the first time in days, he felt something other than anger. He felt relief. 3 weeks later, Colton Ward was arrested. He'd been hiding in Motel 2 counties over using a fake name. When the police found him, he tried to run. They caught him in the parking lot and cuffed him in front of a dozen witnesses. Norman heard about it from Detective Harrison. He called to let him know. Norman thanked him and hung up. That evening, Norman told Ruby. She cried again. This time, there were definitely tears of relief. Colton was charged with assault, child endangerment, and multiple counts of witness intimidation. His trial was set for 6 months out. His bail was denied. Ruby and Rowan stayed with Norman. They didn't talk about going back to the house. Ruby said she never wanted to see it again. Norman didn't push. He just made room for them. He turned his home office into a second bedroom. He cleared out space in the garage for Rowan's bike. He made breakfast every morning and dinner every night. Slowly, things started to feel normal again. Ruby smiled more. She started baking in Norman's kitchen. Cookies, bread, pies. She said it felt good to create something again. Norman ate everything she made and told her it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. Rowan started playing again. He laughed. He ran around the yard. He asked Norman to teach him how to use tools. And Norman spent hours in the garage with him, showing him how to fix things, how to measure, how to cut wood, how to be patient. One evening, Norman and Ruby sat on the back porch, watching Rowan play near the lake. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was cool. The trees rustled. Ruby turned to Norman. Dad, why did you do all this? Because you're my daughter. But you risked so much. The police could have arrested you. Colton could have hurt you. You, Ruby. Norman looked at her. You don't understand. I didn't risk anything. I protected what's mine. That's not a risk. That's a responsibility. Ruby's eyes filled with tears. I don't deserve you. Yes, you do. She leaned her head on his shoulder and they sat there in silence watching the sun sink below the horizon. A few days later, Norman received a letter. It was from Jennifer Hayes. She wrote to thank him for standing up to Colton. She said hearing that he'd been arrested gave her hope. That maybe she could finally stop looking over her shoulder. That maybe other women could too. Norman read the letter twice. Then he folded it and put in his notebook. Another piece of evidence. Another story. Another reason why what he'd done mattered. That night, Norman sat at the kitchen table with his notebook in front of him. He flipped through the pages, all the notes, all the evidence, all the planning. It had worked, not perfectly, not easily, but had worked. He closed the notebook and set it aside. Then he looked out the window. The lake was calm. The stars were bright. The house was quiet. And for the first time in weeks, Norman felt at peace. He didn't forgive Colton Ward. He never would. Forgiveness wasn't something men like Colton deserved. But Norman didn't need to forgive him. He just needed to make sure he could never hurt anyone again. And he had. Norman stood and walked to the window. He watched the moonlight dance across the water. Somewhere out there, Colton was sitting in a jail cell, finally facing the consequences of his actions. Somewhere out there, Ruby and Rowan were safe. Healing, starting over. Norman had done what he set out to do. He protected his family. He made sure the system worked even when it didn't want to. He'd been ruthless, unyielding, strategic, and he'd won. Norman turned away from a window and walked to the guest bedroom. He knocked softly. Ruby opened the door. She looked tired but content. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Everything's fine. Just wanted to check on you." Ruby smiled. "We're good, Dad." "Better than good." Norman nodded. "Good night." "Good night." He closed the door and walked back to his own room. He lay down in bed and stared at the ceiling. The house creaked. The wind whispered through the trees. And somewhere in the distance, an owl called out into the night. Norman closed his eyes. He didn't dream. He didn't need to because the nightmare was over and they were finally safe.